during a knife-throwing demonstration that had gone forward despite a light rain making the ground slick. Rather than acknowledge the dangers or make meaningful changes, Callahan doubled down. He refused to take responsibility. And once again, Ezra found himself questioning everything. As far as Ezra could see, the Callahan who once championed simplicity and community had become a man increasingly focused on publicity, performance, and pushing back against anyone who didn't see the world his way. And perhaps the most painful example of this came with the passing of Otis Lang, Callahan's close friend and longtime collaborator. Otis had been a fixture at Pine Hollow, helping Callahan with countless projects and sharing his dream of teaching others. But when Otis died after a long illness, the show barely mentioned it. Viewers were confused. Why wouldn't the program honor someone so beloved? And why didn't Callahan fight to give Otis the tribute he deserved? Ezra couldn't understand it. If their friendship had been as deep as it seemed, why not stand up and say something? By now, Ezra had seen enough. While he continued to appear on Backcountry Legends, he did so with a heavy heart. His disappointment in Callahan grew stronger every time he saw him on screen talking about needing money, complaining about time, or chasing projects that seemed to design. Ezra Colt is the soft-spoken, no-nonsense woodsman who's basically the backbone of Backcountry Legends. Well, turns out even the most peaceful souls have their limits, and Ezra Colt just dropped a truth bomb that's got longtime fans rethinking everything they thought they knew about the show. Now, we all thought the Backcountry Legends crew was just one big, rugged family, right? No, for years, Ezra kept his lips sealed. But something changed. So don't blink, don't scroll, and whatever you do, do not click away. Stay with me. This is one you're not going to want to miss. In the beginning, there was mutual admiration. When the show debuted back in 2011, audiences were introduced to a cast that looked more like living legends than television personalities. Ezra Colt, then already well into his 70s, was calm, patient, and humble, a man who had spent decades living off the grid with his wife in the Bitterroot backcountry of Montana. Callahan Reeve, on the other hand, was passionate, outspoken, and often philosophical. He ran Pine Hollow Homestead, a kind of living museum where he taught people how to live the old way. Viewers were drawn to the contrast. Ezra had the demeanor of a quiet woodsman, while Callahan had the energy of a fiery preacher. And yet, there was a sense that these two respected one another, that behind the cameras, they understood what the other stood for. Could it have been genuine camaraderie? In those early seasons, Ezra admired Callahan's boldness. He found inspiration in Callahan's determination to pass down skills that most of the world had forgotten. Callahan, in turn, seemed to value Ezra's no-frills approach to wilderness life. But as time wore on, and as the show gained popularity, subtle cracks began to form in that picture of mutual respect. While Ezra quietly lived his values, never boasting, never seeking the spotlight, Callahan began to seem different, louder, more concerned with money, more theatrical. And as it turns out, that shift wasn't just visible to viewers. It was deeply felt by Ezra. One of the first things that gave Ezra pause was Callahan's growing obsession with money. Fans noticed it too, while Ezra made do with what he had, even crafting his own tools and clothing. Callahan began to bring up financial pressures in nearly every episode. And this struck Ezra as odd. Wasn't this the same man who preached about simplicity and living off the land? Wasn't the whole point to reject the rat race, not complain about not keeping up with it? Ezra never said much on camera, but behind the scenes, those contradictions started to bother him. Then came the legal troubles. In the show's third year, county officials paid a visit to Pine Hollow Homestead after receiving anonymous complaints. What they found were structures built without permits, without proper sanitation, and in clear violation of local codes. Now, many would argue that a man like Callahan, who had always rejected bureaucracy, might have seen these inspections as an intrusion. And sure enough, instead of working with officials to bring things up to code, Callahan pushed back. Hard, he fought the system tooth and nail. But this wasn't just some harmless misunderstanding about building codes. It led to the temporary shutdown of his beloved homestead. And to Ezra, that was a red flag. Ezra believed in cooperation. In Montana, he had always gotten along with neighbors and local officials alike. He never sought out conflict, especially not over principles that could have been negotiated. So to see Callahan take such an aggressive stance, refusing to compromise, refusing to work things out, made Ezra question whether his old friend truly lived by the values he claimed to represent. Things only got worse. Callahan began clashing with his neighbors. One especially troubling dispute involved a property line disagreement that escalated into shouting matches caught on a neighbor's trail camera. It wasn't just a case of a man defending his land anymore. It looked more like someone who had lost his ability to coexist peacefully. For Ezra, who had always taken pride in being a good neighbor, that was unsettling. And then there were the safety issues at Callahan's survival school. On more than one occasion, Pine Hollow Homestead was cited for unsafe conditions. In one troubling incident, a visiting student was injured deemed more for TV than for real life. For Ezra, wilderness lived. Callahan, on the other hand, appeared to drift further from the man Ezra once admired. So, as the seasons passed and Ezra celebrated his 80th birthday on the show, his relationship with Callahan had quietly but completely unraveled. While fans may never have seen it play out on screen, the tension was real. The man Ezra once saw as a fellow traveler had become, in his eyes, something else entirely. Someone more concerned with the image of mountain living than the reality of it. And that's how one of reality television's most compelling, unspoken feuds came to be. Not through shouting matches or dramatic fallouts, but through a slow, quiet realization that sometimes people who start on the same path don't always end up walking it together. You won't believe which backcountry legend's star made Ezra Colt's blood boil the most. He's finally spilling the truth. And trust me, number one will leave your jaw on the floor. Stick around to see who really pushed him over the edge. While most of the backcountry legends cast gradually picked up their survival skills as the cameras rolled and the seasons changed, Denny Rourke stood apart as someone who had already earned his stripes in the wild long before the network ever knocked on his cabin door. Denny wasn't just playing the part of a rugged mountain dweller. He truly lived it. Born in the early 1950s in southern Idaho, Denny grew up watching his father hunt. And from those early days, something about the way his father tracked and moved through the woods stirred a passion in him. That childhood fascination didn't fade. It flourished. Years later, settled in Montana's remote and picturesque Sapphire Valley with his wife June, Denny made a name for himself tracking mountain lions with a disciplined pack of hounds. To locals, he was more than just another hunter. He was a protector. His reputation wasn't built on stories or hearsay. It was earned through decades of real, gritty work in the wilderness. But despite that foundation of experience, Denny's on-screen presence didn't sit well with everyone, especially not with fellow backcountry legends cast member Ezra Colt. Now, Ezra Colt isn't someone who's quick to criticize. A seasoned tanner and moccasin maker who spent years perfecting his craft in the Bitterroot backcountry, Ezra had a deep respect for those who truly embraced the mountain lifestyle. So when Denny first appeared on the show in its second season, Ezra was actually impressed. After all, they were both Montana men, just on opposite ends of the map. They faced the same biting winters, the same unpredictable wildlife, and the same self-reliant way of life. Denny's reputation had preceded him. Locals already referred to him as the protector of a valley. Years earlier, when a particularly aggressive mountain lion had killed livestock and started posing a serious threat to a nearby ranch, Denny had been the one the wildlife authorities called. That kind of real-world credibility resonated with Ezra. He saw in Denny a kindred spirit, someone who didn't just live in the mountains but truly belonged there. But as time wore on and more episodes aired, Ezra's admiration began to give way to a quiet sense of confusion and eventually disappointment. What was going on with Denny's storylines? Why did so many of them feel off? Ezra had always been honest about the show needing a little extra drama here and there. He himself once acknowledged that producers would push to make his life seem more dangerous because, in his words, otherwise it's too boring. But with Denny, it went beyond subtle exaggeration. Denny's segments began to feel like they were stuck in a repetitive, overly dramatic loop, especially when it came to his dogs. And here's where things really started to wear on Ezra's nerves. Denny was portrayed as this expert houndsman, someone whose livelihood depended on the ability of his dogs to track and corner wild predators. But episode after episode, the same storyline played out. Denny would lose his dogs in the woods, wander around looking worried, and eventually either find them or call off the hunt. Viewers who weren't familiar with hound hunting might have bought into the tension, but to someone like Ezra, who understood how this actually worked, it didn't add up. The dogs weren't just running free. They were equipped with GPS collars and radio trackers. Denny knew exactly where they were the whole time. So why the theatrics? Even more frustrating was how often Denny's dogs seemed to fail. Despite being introduced as a seasoned lion hunter, his hounds were constantly shown losing tracks, getting injured, or failing to corner even a bobcat. In one especially eyebrow-raising moment, Denny claimed his dogs didn't know how to cross a shallow creek, which left even casual viewers scratching their heads. And for Ezra, who knew how much skill and training went into building a reliable pack, this depiction just felt wrong. It didn't reflect the reality of what Denny was supposedly good at. In fact, it seemed to undermine it entirely. Was it really fair to portray someone as an expert while constantly showing them failing at their core skill? What pushed Ezra further toward skepticism was the emotional weight layered into Denny's segments. The show devoted a lot of time to the birth and eventual loss of one of Denny's dogs, a hound named Maple. While the grief was likely real and understandable, the way it was presented, complete with slow-motion shots, tearful reflections, and an extended puppy-choosing subplot, felt to Ezra like the producers were milking the moment for every ounce of drama. Was this about real life, or just another attempt to tug at viewers' heartstrings? Ezra never confronted Denny about it directly. That wasn't his way. But those closest to him say the frustration lingered for seasons, quietly reshaping how he viewed a man he'd once considered a peer cut from the same cloth. Ezra Colt has always been the quiet one, but not today. He's naming names, and some of the people on this list will seriously shock you. Want to know who he truly couldn't stand? Wait till you hear who's at number 1. When Silas Wren first appeared on Backcountry Legends in its 5th season, many longtime fans of the show didn't quite know what to make of him. Here was this heavily tattooed man, wielding blacksmith tools like an artist with a paintbrush, stepping into a world that had, up until that point, been dominated by more rugged, understated survivalists. His look was striking, bearded, inked and intense, and his skill set even more so. As a master blacksmith with more than 2 decades of experience under his belt, Silas brought something different to the show. And yet that difference, as intriguing as it was to some viewers, raised more than a few eyebrows behind the scenes, particularly with Backcountry Legends veteran Ezra Colt. You see, Ezra Colt wasn't just another personality on a wilderness reality show. He was the real deal, a leather tanner, trapper, and true blue mountain man who had been living off the grid in Montana's unforgiving wilderness long before television ever came knocking. So, when Silas arrived with his polished skill set and compelling backstory, Ezra couldn't help but wonder, was this guy really cut from the same cloth? Or was he just a bit too camera-ready? Silas's journey to the Backcountry Legends cast was anything but conventional. He was born in Colorado and grew up learning survival basics from his father and grandfather. He earned a black belt in martial arts and, interestingly enough, worked for a time as a line cook in a mountain resort town. Now that alone might make someone pause. How does one go from restaurant kitchens to forging knives in the middle of the desert? That's the thing. Silas's life had layers. After a difficult personal loss, he pivoted away from restaurants and toward his passion for bladesmithing, eventually founding his own forge. This transformation caught the eye of the network, who were by then seeking fresh faces and new narratives to spice up their successful reality series. Silas quickly became a fan favorite. His blacksmithing segments were mesmerizing to watch, and his homesteading life with his wife Dana and daughter Wren in the high desert offered a compelling twist to the traditional Backcountry Legends format. Eventually, the family moved to Arkansas, where Silas continued to live off-grid and forge a life of self-sufficiency. To many viewers, he represented a rare balance of old-world craftsmanship and modern resilience. But behind the cameras, the dynamic wasn't all smooth sailing. Ezra Colt, who had built his reputation on decades of genuine hardship and wilderness know-how, reportedly had mixed feelings about Silas from the get-go. According to those familiar with the situation, Ezra appreciated skill when he saw it, but he couldn't ignore the red flags. For one, Silas's wide-ranging background, from martial artist to line cook to blacksmith, seemed a little too convenient for reality TV. Was this really a man who had dedicated his life to mountain living? Or was this someone who had shaped his narrative to fit a television script? Ezra didn't just question Silas's resume. He questioned the way the show portrayed him. Backcountry legends had always been about raw, unfiltered survival. But Silas's segments often looked a bit too curated. Scenes of him forging axes in the comfort of his workshop didn't quite match the life and death stakes that Ezra faced regularly in Montana's harsh winters. Ezra had endured everything from wild animal encounters to brutal snowstorms and food shortages. Meanwhile, Silas seemed to operate in a world where survival looked a lot more like art than necessity. And then there was the matter of experience and timeline. There was some ambiguity around exactly how long Silas had actually been living off-grid before the cameras arrived, with different segments implying different lengths of time. That inconsistency didn't sit right with Ezra. In his eyes, you earned your stripes out there, not through vague timelines or dramatic retellings. And when someone's history started to feel fuzzy, it raised questions about how much of their wilderness lifestyle was real and how much was performative. Ezra also grew uneasy watching Silas's role on the show expand. He reportedly noticed that as Silas's popularity surged, so did his screen time. Suddenly, Silas was being promoted as a seasoned guide and educator, someone teaching viewers the ins and outs of wilderness survival and homesteading. To Ezra, that fell off. How could someone with just a few years of off-grid living under their belt be positioned as an expert? Especially when folks like him had been walking the walk for decades. The tension didn't boil over publicly, but it quietly simmered behind the scenes. Ezra, a man of quiet pride and authenticity, felt the show was drifting away from its original roots. Backcountry legends were becoming more polished, more entertainment-driven, and in Silas, he saw a symbol of that shift. Not that Silas was to blame. He was doing what he did best. But for Ezra, who had sacrificed comfort and recognition for the purity of a wildlife, all felt like a slow drift away from what the show once stood for. Harlan Voss's approach to wilderness life wasn't just about chopping wood and catching dinner. No, it was something far more intense, almost philosophical in its extremity. He didn't just live off the grid. He practically erased it, after earning a degree in environmental science. Not something you'd expect from someone who'd later vanish into the Alaskan backcountry. Harlan set out on a personal journey that took him to the remote corners of the Alaska Range. And this wasn't just a temporary escape from society. He built his life around complete, almost obsessive self-sufficiency. A lot of people talk about simplifying, but Harlan, at one point, he hiked well over 200 miles on foot across one of the most unforgiving landscapes in the country just to reach his own property. No guides, no shortcuts. Just him, the mountains, and his mission. And while most survivalists boast a laundry list of past jobs that paint them as jack-of-all-trades, Harlan's resume genuinely backed up his off-the-grid expertise. He'd worked in everything from cabinetry to fish processing to guiding horseback expeditions. That experience, plus his time as a wrangler in remote hunting camps, gave him a deep, hard-earned relationship with both the land and the animals that roam it. He wasn't just surviving. He was thriving, at least by his own definition. But here's the big question. How do you coexist on a show with other wilderness experts when your idea of wilderness living veers into the realm of philosophical extremism? That was the crux of the quiet tension between Harlan Voss and Ezra Colt. Ezra, a beloved fan favorite, came from a different school of thought. For Ezra, the wilderness wasn't just a backdrop for some existential odyssey. It was home. It was a place where old traditions lived on, where a man could trap 10 hides and build a meaningful, sustainable life without cutting himself off completely from the world. His life in Montana's Bitterroot backcountry reflected that. A well-built cabin, a network of friends and neighbors, and a lifestyle that balanced hardship with comfort. So when Harlan came barreling in with his high-stakes living philosophy, where every day was potentially life or death, where comfort was a sign of weakness, Ezra couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. Sure, he respected Harlan's grit. Who wouldn't? But Ezra also believed there was a difference between being brave and being reckless. Was it really necessary to hike across an entire mountain range with barely enough supplies just to prove a point? Was living well over 100 miles from the nearest town, with no backup, truly admirable, or just a stubborn defiance of common sense. Ezra, like many of the show's viewers, saw the red flags. He believed in living close to nature, yes, but also in managing its resources with care. That meant harvesting wood with a conservationist's eye, maintaining a balance, and keeping a weathered, well-earned respect for the dangers of the wild. Harlan, on the other hand, was known to simply cut down cottonwood trees for fodder, without planning for regrowth. That rubbed people the wrong way. And Ezra? Well, Ezra thought that kind of approach might eventually backfire. Their different philosophies were visible not just in what they said, but in how they lived. One scene, which left a strong impression, showed Harlan battling brutal winds that tore at the roof of his shelter and threatened his entire food supply. Ezra watched, not in glee but with concern. Why put yourself through that kind of ordeal when there were safer, smarter ways to build a life in the wilderness? And that was the heart of their clash. It wasn't personal animosity. It was philosophical. Ezra believed wilderness skills should lead to a balanced, sustainable existence, one that still included friendships, community, and comfort when earned. Harlan? He seemed to see those very things as the enemy. For him, every day was a test. Every hardship was a badge of honor. Isolation wasn't a side effect. It was a goal. Even their relationship with the camera crew and the show itself underscored their differences. Ezra took it all in stride, accepting that some dramatization was part of reality TV. Harlan, meanwhile, seemed to blur the lines between the show and real life, injecting real danger into his day-to-day, even when safer options were available, like when he decided to cross icy rivers with nothing more than a small inflatable raft. Was that determination or a form of wilderness theater? Ezra didn't say it outright, but one had to wonder, was Harlan living the way he did because he believed in it, or because he wanted to be seen doing it? And then there was the irony. After all those years rejecting the system, Harlan eventually earned a pilot's license for small backcountry planes. The same man who once refused any mechanical support for his treks eventually took to the skies. Even Ezra had to shake his head at that. Had Harlan evolved, or had reality simply caught up to him? When Harlan and his partner left the show after its 8th season, it didn't come with fireworks or controversy, just a quiet closing of a chapter. And in Ezra's eyes, it didn't change much. He continued to tip his hat to Harlan's authenticity, because for all the disagreements, there was no denying Harlan lived what he preached. But Ezra also remained firm in his belief that survival shouldn't mean constant suffering, that life in the wild could and should be hard, but never needlessly punishing. So in the end, their paths diverged not because one was right and the other wrong, but because they simply saw the wilderness through very different lenses. One saw it as a test of isolation and limits, the other as a place to live fully, and maybe even comfortably, with nature. Two mountain men, two philosophies, one deep and unspoken divide. We always thought the Backcountry Legends cast was one big happy family, but